Really, really appreciate it. Please click to subscribe. Appreciate all the support. It's been 89 days now since Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home right here up that driveway, Tucson, Arizona. I can't believe I've been covering this now for 89 days since February 1st, pretty much. And you guys have seen me interview a lot of FBI profilers, retired FBI profilers, people whose entire job.
When it comes to the darkest corners of criminal investigation, this is the work few people ever truly see. Investigators will sit down with the most dangerous offenders imaginable, from abductors to predators and beyond, and spend days, weeks, sometimes even months trying to understand how their minds work. Every conversation, every detail, every pattern matters. That information is carefully gathered and preserved so that when a case like the still unsolved Nancy Guthrie investigation demands answers, experts can look back at what they have learned from past offenders and start building a profile of the person who may be responsible. That behind-the-scenes process is what makes these cases so gripping and, frankly, so chilling. Authorities can study the behavioral clues left behind, compare them with years of collected insight from similar crimes, and begin shaping a clearer picture of who they may be searching for. It is the kind of methodical, psychological detective work that the public rarely hears about, yet it could be playing a major role right now in the Nancy Guthrie case. That is exactly why this process felt so fascinating to explore. What is it really like to walk into a maximum security prison, sit face to face with someone capable of horrific violence, and try to pull meaningful truth from that conversation? What does it take to keep talking, keep listening, and keep analyzing when the person across from you has done something unthinkable? To open up that world, this episode begins with Jim Clemente, a retired FBI profiler, who offers a closer look at how this extraordinary process actually works.
When you're a profiler and you have a suspect that you are able to talk to.
Okay.
How
So
do
in
you
the
go through?
beginning, in the early days of the behavioral science unit, which then evolved into the behavioral analysis unit, the original profilers interviewed 38 serial offenders after conviction. And the way they did that is they typically waited a certain period of time and then approached them after they felt that the offender had realized they were going to spend the rest of their lives in prison and they've lost all control over what happens to them. And they basically would, at that point, feel like they are going to eventually just die in obscurity. We used that to our advantage by basically building up their egos, telling them we wanted to study them, we wanted to learn from them. And then these offenders started to agree to be interviewed by the people in the behavioral science unit. And eventually that evolved into empirical studies. Those were anecdotal interviews, but now, and from the time I was in the behavioral analysis unit, we developed a protocol, and I believe it was somewhere in the area of 840 questions that we would go through with every single serial offender who agreed to talk to us. And we would do that for every crime they committed. And many times that was accomplished because we basically built up their ego. Other times we were able to get the prosecutor and the judge to agree to demand that and to order that of the offender in order to do things like take the death penalty off the table. And there have been people, I think, who've complained about that because that's what the offender wanted. But that's absolutely true. It is what the offender wants. But we're using that basically against the offender. We're using that to gain more information so that we can actually profile crimes, hopefully educate people in the public, and prevent these kinds of crimes from happening in the future. But also, once they do start happening, it will help us to stop serial offenders in their tracks, prevent them from going on indefinitely killing people. And so this is something that I did when I was in the behavioral analysis unit, and all my colleagues did it as well. We all engaged in these studies, and we traveled to various max security prisons or supermax prisons and interviewed offenders when they would agree to do that. And those could be serial rapists or serial murderers or both, serial child abductors as well. The fact is that this is an incredibly rich source of information. We ask them questions designed to elicit not only what they were thinking when they were doing certain things. So that gave us the why, right? And we've talked about before how they committed the crime plus the why they committed the crime leads us to who committed the crime, what kind of person committed that crime. And so it really helps us knowing all this and building up this institutional knowledge in the behavioral analysis unit that's passed down from generation to generation of profiler. This helps us read crime scenes and determine, oh, when we see a particular aspect of a crime in the crime scene, we can say, oh, well, we've interviewed X number of people. And that number went from 38 by the original profilers to about 1,500 by the time I retired from the BAU. But we can say that in a certain number, or in the majority of these cases, when somebody did this particular act, it was because of this particular thought pattern or plan or motive on their part. And because of that, it tells us it leaks out information about the offender. And so we can then tell people more and more and more about the kind of offender in our profiles of these unknown offenders.
Did you find that most of them were honest, or that they wanted to talk to you?
Well, those are two very different things. Generally they wanted to talk to us because of their ego and the fact that they were stuck in prison for the rest of their life. Their honesty, in order to ensure that, we did two things. We studied every single crime that they committed and crime scene before we talked to them. And then after we talked to them, we went back and reviewed it in light of what?
In the world of violent crime investigation, some of the most important answers do not begin with fingerprints, surveillance clips, or even a confession. They begin with a harder question, one that investigators return to again and again when a case appears baffling to the public: why? Why was this victim chosen? Why was this method used? Why did the offender take this risk, leave this clue, or act with this degree of control or cruelty? In the conversation at the center of this report, a former behavioral analysis unit profiler explains that once investigators understand the why behind a crime, and once they study the how, they move closer to the most urgent question of all: who committed it? That is the logic behind profiling as it has developed over decades inside the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, or BAU. It is also the logic behind prison interviews with some of the most disturbing offenders in the United States, including killers, serial predators, and child abductors. The discussion offers a rare look at how those interviews are conducted, why offenders often agree to speak, what investigators learn from them, and why those lessons can shape cases long after the original crimes fade from the front pages. What makes this especially compelling is the way the conversation connects those methods to names the public already recognizes, including Nancy Guthrie, described here as an 84-year-old woman whose case feels deeply atypical, Brian Kohberger, whose motive continues to draw intense scrutiny, and Rex Hoyerman, the Gilgo Beach suspect whose interactions with investigators may now become a major source of insight. At its core, this is a story about institutional knowledge and about the uncomfortable reality that law enforcement often learns how to stop the worst offenders by sitting across from them, listening to them, and allowing them, in carefully controlled settings, to describe exactly what they did and why they did it. The former profiler says that what began with 38 interviews conducted by the original generation of profilers grew to roughly 1,500 interviews by the time he retired from the BAU. That body of experience, recorded on audio and video and preserved alongside case notes, becomes part of a professional library passed down from generation to generation of profiler. The purpose is not fascination. It is prevention, identification, and interpretation. When a new crime scene reveals a familiar pattern, investigators can compare that behavior with the thinking described in hundreds of earlier interviews. The profiler's point is blunt and memorable: behavior leaks out information about the offender. That idea runs through every part of this discussion, from the mechanics of prison interviews to the emotional burden placed on investigators, from the challenge of analyzing an unusual case such as Nancy Guthrie's to the question of why an offender like Brian Kohberger may not yet be ready to talk while someone like Rex Hoyerman may be willing now. The former profiler explains the method in practical terms. In his account, the why and the how of a crime are not separate from the who. They are the pathway to it. When investigators study how an act was carried out and why it was carried out in that particular way, they are building a picture of the mind behind it. That picture is not mystical and it is not guesswork. It grows from repetition, comparison, and accumulated experience. He describes how the BAU developed a form of institutional knowledge over many years, knowledge built by interviewing offenders, reviewing crime scenes, comparing patterns, and then passing those lessons to the next generation of profilers. Early in that process, the original profilers had interviewed 38 offenders. By the time he retired, that total had grown to about 1,500. That expansion matters because it turns isolated impressions into broader patterns. It allows experienced profilers to say that when a person performs a certain act at a crime scene, in a significant number of prior cases that act was associated with a specific thought pattern, plan, or motive. In other words, a behavior observed in the physical world may point back to an internal logic in the offender's mind. Once that logic becomes clearer, investigators can say more about the kind of person they are looking for, even when the offender remains unknown. That process, however, depends on access to the offenders themselves, and here the conversation becomes especially revealing. Asked whether the people he interviewed were honest and whether they wanted to talk, the profiler draws a sharp distinction between willingness and truthfulness. He says those are two very different things. In his telling, many offenders wanted to talk because of ego and because they were facing life in prison. Attention, relevance, and the chance to revisit their crimes could all become incentives. But wanting to talk did not mean being fully honest. To improve the odds of reliable information, investigators did two things. First, they studied every single crime that they committed and crime scene before we talked to them. Then, after the interview, they went back and reviewed the material again in light of what the offender had said. This double-checking mattered because it helped investigators test the accuracy of each account, compare claimed motives with the known evidence, and identify where an offender might be exaggerating, minimizing, or reshaping events. The result was not blind trust. It was structured listening under conditions designed to maximize accuracy. The former profiler is also direct about a grim but important detail. Investigators often allowed offenders, as distasteful as it is, to relive the crimes in their minds. For many members of the public, that is a deeply unsettling idea. Yet he explains that many offenders really liked that opportunity, and that this willingness to revisit the crime often produced more detail. In the cold calculus of criminal investigation, that detail could later help solve cases, identify patterns, refine profiles, and prevent future attacks. This is the moral tension that runs beneath the entire profession. The interview does not romanticize the work. It makes clear that investigators were not engaging these offenders out of sympathy or fascination, but because those conversations could help prevent future murders, future serial rapes, and future child abductions. In other words, the unpleasantness of the process was accepted because the alternative, operating with less knowledge, was worse.